Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Adam Green with No More News. It is April 4th, 2019, and today I'm proud to bring you my guest, Christopher John Bjerknes. He is an incredible author and researcher of many powerful books, and I have been wanting to interview him at the top of my list since I've been focusing on end times prophecy and Chabad Lubavitch and Zionism. His YouTube channel is CJB Books, and he's also blogging over at Blogspot. We'll be getting into some of his posts there. He has been on the circuit doing radio shows over the last few decades, and I'm honored to get him on Skype in video. Is very privilege and honor, and I've got a lot of admiration and respect for this man's work. I hope to share his info with all of you and spread this info. Thank you so much for joining me, Christopher.
Thank you so very much for having me, and that was a wonderful introduction. I think the best I've ever had. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I'm honored to give it to you because you really deserve it. I have been covering this Jewish end times prophecy, Zionist prophecy, for the over a year now, very extensively in depth, many videos. And I just wanted to show here, some people like try to give me credit for my research, but I always say people long before me were covering this. This is you, Christopher John Bjerknes, the Rothschilds and their Moshiach. Oh, I'm in the wrong screen here. The Rothschilds and their Moshiach, an interview you did in 2006. So you've known about this stuff that I've been covering the last year for the last 13 years. How long before 2006 were you on these issues? First question. And what has it been like to watch all of this unfolding in the last 13 years since then? It must be crazy to watch how it's intensifying.
I really heavily started getting into it after I published my first book, Albert Einstein, the Incorrigible Plagiarist. And one of the things that hit me when I was researching Einstein, I immediately got accused of anti-Semitism. So I looked into Zionism and discovered that it was a very racist belief system, and that it was ironic that I was being accused of racism for exposing their racism. And when I looked into that, the thing that hit me was that Albert Einstein wanted both global governance and a nation state of Israel, which is an inherent contradiction because he was a nationalist for Jews, but for Gentiles, he was an internationalist and essentially a communist. So that conundrum stuck with me, and then I started thinking about it, and it occurred to me, well, that's what Jewish messianic prophecy calls for. Jewish messianic prophecy calls for the destruction of all the kings and queens and the replacement of their reign by a world government governed from Jerusalem. And Jewish messianic prophecy also calls for the Jews to have an ingathering into Palestine in the end times. So Einstein was in perfect conformity with Jewish messianic prophecy. And that led me to investigate both those prophecies and how they were being artificially fulfilled and deliberately fulfilled ever since the time of Moses Hess and the Rothschilds' early movement to establish a Zionist state in the 1810s and 18 teens.
Interesting that you mentioned 1810s because in a lot of my videos, I've shown a letter that a rabbi sent the Rothschilds in 1829, I want to say, maybe 1836. There was an article written in 1829, and the rabbi sent a letter to Rothschild in 1836, I believe. I'm getting it mixed up. But around then, in asking him to buy the Temple Mount so that they could rebuild the temple.
I'm not surprised. In New York, there were several Jewish newspapers that were calling Rothschild King of the Jews. And this was early on when he was just starting to accumulate his vast fortunes. Mm-hmm. So I think that his fortunes were given to him so that he could promote this cause. I don't think it was just his cleverness. There were many wealthy Jewish families who invested in the Rothschild family.
Right.
And there was another man, Mordecai Emanuel Noah, in America calling for the restoration of the Jews. And like Manasseh ben Israel, a few centuries before, he said that the American Indians were one of the lost tribes of Israel, mm-hmm. and that they could create a Jewish settlement in America that would allow them to concentrate enough Jews to make a viable transition over to Palestine.
So Einstein was your gateway into Zionism and all this end times prophecy stuff?
Not the end times prophecy. That I saw from evangelicals on television from the early 1970s on, and I had many friends who would resent me for saying this, but they were Bible thumpers. And we used to sit in coffee shops and talk about it and slam the Bible on the table every once in a while. But I was aware of all that early on, but it was Einstein who keyed me into Zionism. And then I found out that Kurt Waldheim and the UN had declared that Zionism was a form of racism and racial segregationism. Mm-hmm. And that was later repealed under Zionist pressure, but that encouraged me to believe that I was on the right path.
Well, I mean, since that interview you did in 2006 about the Rothschilds and the Moshiach, so much has unfolded and intensified in the last few years with the Trump presidency. He's on the coin now with the temple, and he's moving the embassy and giving them the Golan, What's your take on all of this? Like, do you think that they're about to actually achieve their end game and get this temple built and anoint a Moshiach?
Yes, I do. And they have the red heifers prepared. Every once in a while, a new red heifer is born. That's the perfect one, just right for the temple sacrifices. They are preparing the Levitical priesthood to do all the rituals and rites. They are undermining the foundations of the Dome of the Rock so that it will crumble of its own weight.
And there's already been mainstream media reporting that any seismic activity at that place is very vulnerable.
Absolutely, and maybe a little seismic activity can be helped along with a few explosives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did a movie about blowing up the Dome of the Rock in 2000 called Time of Favor, an Israeli movie about a rabbi convincing one of his disciples to go steal some bombs from the IDF and go to a tunnel underneath and blow it up, but then they stop him at the last moment.
Well, there's something called sympathetic magic. And sometimes things are done so that it will manifest itself in reality through the symbolism of imagery.
Yeah. And, a lot of people, I hear people say, like, Israel was founded by secular Bolshevik communists, and that the Rothschilds hijacked Judaism to create the state of Israel and just are using it as a cloak to get power. I've seen articles, though, of the Rothschilds on Chabad.org that they are deeply religious. So what's your take on that? And do you think it will be a Rothschild that they hail as the Moshiach one day? Or Yeah, go ahead.
That's a multifaceted question.
Yeah.
There was a issue that the Zionists faced that was very difficult for them to overcome until they had weakened the Catholic Church and sent Islam into disorder and destroyed the Ottoman Empire. In both Catholicism, especially in Christianity generally, from the early church fathers, they held that the Church of Rome should handle Jerusalem, and that if the Jews were to return to Israel, it would be a manifestation of the Antichrist. And the Muslims have a similar belief with al-Dajjal that is like the Antichrist. So both faiths, who greatly outnumber the Jews, were strongly opposed to any Jewish resettlement in Israel, and they were not alone. Many ultra-Orthodox Jews and even conservative Jews believe that the Talmud in Ketubot, Tractate Ketubot, folio, I think 111a or 111b, says that the Jews should not return in great numbers to Jerusalem until the Messiah returns. Mm-hmm. Now, if the Rothschilds believe that they are the Messiah, then they believe they have the right under Jewish law to retake Palestine. But there is a contender to the throne for the Davidic line that will be the Moshiach, and there are two Moshiachs. There's Moshiach ben David and Moshiach ben Joseph. One is a warrior, and the other is more of a king. One will lead the war, and one will lead the kingdom. Now, Menachem Mendel Schneerson is viewed by Chabad Lubavitch, at least I would say half of them, as being the Moshiach. I've never heard them specify which Moshiach. But the Rothschilds in the 19th century were repeatedly called the King of the Jews, which is strong evidence that they were viewed as the Moshiach.
I've done a few videos.
But
okay, go ahead.
Another aspect of your question, which is very important, it's a very insightful question, is that the issue of political Zionism and racial Zionism. Racial Zionism was instigated by Moses Hess in his book Rome and Jerusalem, and political Zionism came from Pinsker and Theodor Herzl, and that was the idea of auto-emancipation, that the Jews would emancipate themselves and then migrate to Israel. That is why they established the idea of political Zionism, is so that they would not run into conflicts with the church or with Muslims, because they said that it was a political movement and not a religious movement. And it also enabled them significantly to gain the support of the anti-Semites. There was a very influential anti-Semite in Germany named Eugen Karl Düring, and he declared that anti-Semitism should be a racial matter and not a religious matter, that Jews in Germany were a foreign alien element, and that they should be opposed based on their race because they were altering not only the culture and religion of Germany, but the racial makeup of Germany. So the political Zionists adopted both the idea that they would not be in conflict with the major Abrahamic religions, including Jews, and they also wanted to utilize the anti-Semites as allies to force the Jews out of every nation and into Palestine.
Right. They wanted to force the Aliyah, and that's what World War II about is, as you write in your book. So,
World War I was about taking Palestine. But once they had taken Palestine, and there was the Palestine Mandate for Britain, and there was the Balfour Declaration, they even tried under Hitler to chase the Jews down to Palestine, but then the Jews would flee again. They didn't like it there. So they had to create an incentive for the Jews to go to Palestine and to stay in Palestine, and that's where Hitler came in.
Right, and then we'll get into your latest book now. So you've got I counted 14 books here that you have available on your website, CJBB Books. I'll be dropping the link in the descriptions, all the links in the description. Your latest book here, Adolf Hitler, Bolshevik and Zionist, Volume 1. So I remember an article that you wrote at your blog about Bolshevism and Zionism, and how it's like a false dichotomy in Churchill's letter, or Churchill's article. So why don't you tell us about the summary of the book? Oh, and some of the other books you wrote too, before we get into that, extensively on Einstein and racial Zionism. Give people the quick summary of Einstein, plagiarist.
Einstein was a plagiarist. He was a racist Zionist. In his travel diaries, he was very xenophobic, and he strongly supported Hitler. He believed in the idea that the only way to prevent the assimilation of Jews with Gentiles was to have firmly anti-Semitic governments in power that would insist upon segregation of the Jews. And he believed that anti-Semitism was a very positive force for Jewry, and that it was a necessary force for Jewry because, like most Zionists, he believed that some Jews should remain in every nation on earth to exert their influence. And he wanted to ensure that Jews not interbreed with non-Jews, even though he was married to a Gentile and his children were half Serbian.
I saw this quote from Einstein that you had. He's against nationalism except for the Jewish cause. So a little
yes, that was that hypocrisy that struck me, that first led me to discover that Einstein was simply fulfilling Jewish messianic prophecy. And for them, it's not hypocrisy because religious Jews view Gentile souls as being different from Jewish souls. So they feel, and as the Old Testament declares in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, that the Jews are a chosen people destined to be above all other people and to lead the earth from Jerusalem. And that was much more recently stated by the communist David Ben-Gurion in an interview he did, I think in 62 or something, of what the world would look like 25 years later. And
right,
he anticipated
the Supreme Court of
that
mankind.
the Supreme, hey,
Yeah.
you know your stuff.
Right, yeah, it's amazing. But didn't Einstein write the letter though against Menachem Begin and called them terrorists
Later on, yes.
later on?
It was a very fluid time, and there were a lot of political influences. And Einstein was kind of like Plato.
Mm-hmm.
He would mold to whomever he had last spoken to, and he was always under the influence of other people. Mm-hmm. That's why he was a plagiarist. He was not good at creating his own thoughts, but he was good at reiterating others' thoughts in a very simple and understandable way. And I think at that time, he may have been worried about the way that Jews were perceived around the world, and he wanted to make it appear that there were good-natured Jews who did not advocate what was happening to the Palestinian people.
I understand.
And they also wanted to quell any fears that this was the manifestation of the Antichrist.
Interesting. And then another book that you wrote recently that I'd like a little to chat a little bit about before we get deep into your latest is Putin's Reign of Terror. I believe tying in with the Chabad Russian mob and Trump and so much of the Chabad connections in his presidency.
Absolutely. A lot of people think that Putin was staunchly anti-Semitic and kicked out the Jewish oligarchs and did all of this to restore the wealth back to the Russian people, but that's not true. What he did was he kicked out the Jewish oligarchs that had been involved with a Jewish organization which was more secular and mainstream, and he put in Jewish oligarchs who were affiliated with Chabad Lubavitch.
Right.
And enabled them to become powerful. So there was nothing anti-Semitic about anything that he did. Instead, he was setting it up so that the Israelis and Russians could collaborate in fulfilling end times prophecy without appearing to do so.
Yeah, the Chabad rabbis in the Temple Institute and all these groups that want to rebuild the temple, they're asking him and Trump to help. And he reportedly visited the Temple Mount and said that he was praying that the temple would be rebuilt. And his Putin's rabbi, the Berel Lazar, the Chabad rabbi in Russia, I just showed in a video the other day, he introduced Rothschild as the Chabad man of honor and says that he's known for being Rothschild's friend. And it's like, oh my gosh, it always connects.
Well, it's been a Rothschild enterprise from the beginning. And it was only the Rothschild family, as one of the Mrs. Rothschilds once said, that governments have to obey the Rothschilds' wishes or they will instigate a war against whatever government opposes them. And they, especially in the 19th century, they had control over the banking interests and the money markets of every government in Europe. So when there's a war going on or a depression, it's very important for governments to borrow money, and the Rothschilds control the purse strings.
Yeah, Rothschild
but Chabad Lubavitch is a very powerful organization, and it misrepresents itself as if it represents most Jews. It does not yet. But if they anoint their Messiah, I suspect things will change very much. And one of their prophetic interests is that once the Messiah is anointed, they can exercise their power more openly. They're told to kind of hide their power so that it does not promote anti-Semitism. But once the Moshiach is anointed in the temple, then they will feel emboldened to express themselves more openly.
And it really seems like Trump is their guy to hasten in the end times. The Rebbe
look at his son-in-law, Jared Kushner.
I know. I've done my most popular video.
They went to pray at the. I'm sorry. They went to pray at the. I don't know if it was the gravesite or the memorial for Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the seventh Rebbe. And the seventh Rebbe is a significant figure. They forecast that they would only have 7 Rebbes. and that the seventh Rebbe would either be the Mashiach or herald the arrival of the Moshiach.
And I just read recently that he told somebody that Netanyahu would be the one to hand the keys to the Moshiach. And Netanyahu used to sleep at the Kushners. Kushner's dad got in trouble for campaign violence, finance violations with Netanyahu. And then now he's like the most powerful guy in the presidency behind Trump. And they're just getting everything they want. Another thing, Trump's connections to
I think Trump borrowed money from some Jewish bankers.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Trump's connections to the Rothschilds being bailed out by Wilbur Ross in the early 90s. And he also got a JNF award in 1983, the Jewish National Fund, which was founded by Herzl at the World Zionist Congress.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
But it fits right in.
83, yeah. And his dad was friends with Netanyahu when he was the ambassador. And he met with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe told him, "You must do more to hasten the Messiah." It's insane. Tell us a little bit about the Rebbe also being saved out of, or do you want to do that when we get more deeper into the book? Because I still wanted to talk premonitions
It's
a little
pertinent
bit.
to the conversation.
Okay.
Everyone has the impression that the Nazis were very anti-Jewish, and yet they rescued the Rebbe. The communists were more opposed to the Rebbe than the Nazis, and the Nazis rescued him and very gingerly escorted him into the hands of the Americans, where he was able to preserve the Hasidic dynasty that he was a member of. And it's a very significant step in the progression to the seventh Rebbe, who is named after him. Far from being anti-Jewish, they preserved the king of the Jews and ensured that the Hasidic dynasty would survive, which was foretold to institute the Jewish world government that they were supposedly opposing by opposing Bolshevism.
And Chabad is like the Ashkenazi Lurian Kabbalah that came out of like the Messianic movement of is it connected to Sabbatai Zevi and the Frankist? It's like the modern version?
Yes. The Lurian Kabbalah introduced the idea of revolutions, and the timing of the Lurian Kabbalah was very significant. Isaac Luria thought that he was one of the two Moshiachs that would instigate the wars through revolution. And then in 1666, Shabbatai Tzvi took on the Lurian Kabbalah and created his own form of Kabbalah. And they thought that the massacres that took place in the Ukraine foreshadowed the atonement of the Jews, which would enable him to become the Messiah of the Jews and restore the Jews to Palestine. So they were very interconnected and heavily related.
Right.
But another thing that's interesting is that they believe that their lineage can be passed on through the process of metempsychosis, that they're reincarnated, and that Jacob Frank was reincarnated from Shabbatai Tzvi.
Right. Yeah, I remember he was saying that. And then now the Rebbe in Chabad has grown to the most influential, basically like mob in the world. They're in countries all over the world. I've been reading an article.
We should point out that he's dead, but they believe that he is still the Mashiach, even though he's dead. Again, it's going to be, that's one of the reasons why I brought that up, is they believe that the Rebbe's soul will be reincarnated into a new person, and that person may be a Rothschild, it may be somebody else. It's very hard to decipher. They probably don't know themselves, but
they're openly calling for the Gentiles to follow the Noahide laws, and they're saying that they want to rebuild the temple, and the time's almost coming. And I'd read an article recently, in the Philippines, there's Noahide cults all over the Philippines, that it's ran by Chabad rabbis, and they openly say that they want this to be a world religion, and that this is like the beta test into the Philippines.
Christians should be aware that the Noahide laws are formulated in the Babylonian Talmud in the tractate Sanhedrin. I think it's folio 56 to 59, and then folio 99, I think, is also significant. And they specify that Christians will be beheaded One of the Noahide commandments is that idol worship is forbidden, and they utilize all kinds of euphemisms to disguise it, but they say that Christians will be beheaded and that only righteous Gentiles will survive into the end times. And they're not even of one mind as to what qualifies as a righteous Gentile and whether or not all righteous Gentiles will only survive as slaves, or if righteous Gentiles will also be exterminated in the end times. There is divergent opinion, and I don't think it's settled, although I'm sure in the minds of the kingdom it is settled, that the king will judge and smash all of the Gentiles. But Christians are being duped into supporting the Noahide laws because that they believe that that is the way that they will become righteous Gentiles and be permitted to survive in the end times.
Amazing. And they're just like openly saying it, but when we cover it, they say, oh, you're an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. They're not trying to take over the world when it's their end times obsession and end game.
All you have to do is read the Old Testament. Read the book of Psalms, read Ezekiel, read Isaiah, read Deuteronomy. It's all right there.
Right.
It's undeniable.
So,
but again, it's tremendously important for them to deceive people that they are a political movement and not a religious movement. Mm-hmm. So they hide behind the idea that Israel was founded on the basis of the Holocaust in order so that no such event will ever take place again, and that Jews have a sanctuary to live in. But the Zionist movement was founded long before the Holocaust took place, and the Holocaust took place in order to make Zionism successful.
Right, yeah, they always make the argument that, oh, what's wrong with us having a Jewish homeland? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with being a Zionist? Why is that a dirty word? Well, it's not just a Jewish homeland. It's the end. If you support Zionism, you're supporting the whole end game in the end, and that is essentially ruling the world from Jerusalem.
And also instigating the final apocalyptic wars.
Yeah, Gog and Magog. In Netanyahu and Israel, I don't know if you've seen how they're dominating in cyber technology and trade with the Belt and Road Initiative. Like, they're putting the pieces into play where they're going to have control of the whole world, emerging from the Middle East after the United States laid waste to it with the War on Terror.
Well, that gave them the hegemony, and they also have absolute control over communist China, which has an...
Oh, just lost him. I think he's having, he's going to plug his camera back in. It shuts off every couple seconds or every couple minutes.
I'm sorry about that.
No problem. I kept it rolling.
So they have absolute control over communist China, and obviously Putin works for them. And as I'm sure you've made your viewers aware, Putin was essentially raised by ultra-Orthodox Jews.
Right, yeah.
Maybe not ultra-Orthodox, but he was raised by Jews who lived in the apartment building with him, who were very kind to him during his childhood.
Well, and it's illegal. You go to jail if you question World War II in Russia.
Yeah, and it's interesting. They always call Hitler and the Nazis fascists, even though the Nazis were not fascist. Hitler was a socialist. Mm-hmm. They never refer to him as a socialist because the Soviet Union was the Soviet Socialist Republics.
So we're going to get to the new book in just a second, but we're moving along to your last book, which was Premonitions of the Holocaust. So when you first came out with your YouTube channel, I saw the video that you did on this, and I was so happy and just incredibly blown away, like jaw to the floor about that. Tell me about 1948 and why the 6 million are so important, and the whole thing about the World War I, World War II, and then what World War III will be. If you could try to sum that up for me. You know, all the three world wars. Sum it up.
The gematria, and I know you've covered gematria. The gematria stems from the Old Testament book of Leviticus in chapter 25, verse 10. And there is, in English, it translates as a phrase, ye shall return. But in Hebrew, it's not a phrase, it's one word. And it was misspelled. And it is missing a vav, which in gematria is equivalent to 6. In gematria, in Hebrew, the characters don't only symbolize consonant sounds, they also symbolize numbers. So if you were to write a sentence in Hebrew, it could be a sentence in words or it could be a series of numbers. And they believe that in the Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10, the phrase "ye shall return" was deliberately misspelled to lack a six. And they interpret that to mean that the Jewish people will return lacking 6 million people. And obviously that was written at least 2,000 years ago and perhaps 2,500 years ago and perhaps even before that, even though our earliest translations are in Greek and not in Hebrew or Aramaic. But anyway, another significant aspect of that missing letter is that the gematria of the year adds up to 5,708, which is the year 1948. So they predicted potentially 2,500 years ago that they would return to Israel in the year 1948, which is the year that Israel was founded. So it was part of a plan. It was not a simple coincidence.
So the 1948 was predicted in gematria, and
But it was also predicted in a Hungarian rabbi named Krul, Crooll, I believe.
Right.
And he said that the Messiah would return in the year 1948, and I think he dated it based on the birth date of King David. And he said that the period from the creation of the world, when Adam was born, to King David amounted to a certain number of years, and then if you doubled it, it would be 5,708, which again is the year 1948. And he made this prediction in a public debate he had with a Protestant minister, and it appeared in several books. And he predicted the year 1948 would be when the Messiah would arrive and the Jews would be restored to Palestine. So again, it's significant that this was part of a plan. This was not something that just mysteriously happened from supernatural powers.
And he said that in 1812, I believe you said?
Yes.
Right? 1812
Yes.
predicted 1948. And then the significance with the less 6 million, this would explain how there was 6 million in all of the articles decades before the Holocaust occurred, right?
Yes, there are two significant authors that I recommend people look into. And the one who really thoroughly investigated the connections. There was a man who wrote a book about the significance of Hebrew words and Hebrew letters, and he was a Rabbi Blech, and it was Ben Weintraub who immediately recognized that this is why they utilized the figure 6 million to identify the number of Jews that were exterminated in the Holocaust, is in order to fulfill this ancient prophecy. And I forget the name of Ben Weintraub's book, but he was the author who really pointed that out. And then there was another man named Don Hedesheim. And I think the name of his book was The First Holocaust or something like that. And he did a wonderful job investigating the numerous statements from 1900 through the 1940s that said that 6 million Jews were in immediate peril of extermination, and they specifically utilized the word Holocaust.
Amazing.
And I think Rudolf Germar has said that since then they've located numerous other citations dating back at least into the 1890s or 1870s, where the Jews were openly forecasting that 6 million Jews would perish in a Holocaust. And it's easy to dismiss by saying that they estimated that that was the population of the Jews and that there would be a complete Holocaust of the Jews, and therefore they arrived at the 6 million. But it seems far more plausible to me that it was significant to their religious prophecies that they established that 6 million Jews were exterminated, which would fulfill the prophecy that enabled them to return to Palestine with their God's permission.
And that would kind of explain why they're so adamant on people saying it's 6 million. The number's not 5,999,000 or not more. It has to be the 6.
It's not 6 million and one.
Yes.
It's 6 million. And it's difficult for them because some of the graveyards where these bodies are supposed to be located don't contain the bodies, and they revised the statistics for Auschwitz-Birkenau, and yet they still maintain that it's precisely 6 million. And I think right after the war, there was a German general or something who claimed that there were 25 million people gassed. And when it was pointed out that his mathematics was in error, then they revised it, and they would generally only give the figure of 6 million Jews, and they would not specify the numbers of communists or include those numbers of communists and Slavs that were also killed in the Holocaust deliberately. And they made it so that they could finagle the figures to make it appear that 6 million Jews had been exterminated.
I'm sure that they were doing some accounting there. So tell me a little bit about the World
But that's
War
why it's so
I and
important.
World
I mean,
War
they
II.
could easily have said 8 million. I think Nazi statisticians said that there were 11 million Jews in all of Europe. But that's why that figure is so significant, and why they have enacted laws throughout the world to make it illegal to claim that any deviance from that figure.
I was reading recently how they're obsessed with talking about how unique their Holocaust was, and how it's really like an evil an event in history that stands separate from everything else. You know, despite the fact that there was hundreds of millions have perished throughout time. We're only we can get into that, but I want to hear about the World War I, World War II. Tell me if the Pike letters are true, and the Benjamin Friedman speech, and Ottoman Empire collapsing, that whole issue.
The aspect of the Benjamin Friedman where he discusses what happened with the Balfour Deceleration is absolutely true and very well done, and has influenced my research quite a bit. The Pike letters were mentioned by some Catholic priest in a book that he published in the 1925, but in the statement of what that letter contained, it said nothing about 3 world wars or Nazis or Zionism. And that was later done, I think, in the 50s and 60s, and since then became a website that was claiming
So it's a hoax. It's a hoax.
Pike,
I have heard that
it's
before.
a hoax.
Right. Okay. Albert Pike. That was the Albert Pike. But he wasn't he a Freemason, a top Freemason, and like founder of the KKK? Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
And he wrote several books on Freemasonry, and he essentially said that Freemasons worship Lucifer. But the meaning of Lucifer to them is the light giver, and in the New Testament it also calls Jesus Christ Lucifer. So it's, again, that's spun to deceive people as to what his intent was when he was saying those things, potentially. Maybe he really did believe he was Lucifer, as most people view Lucifer.
Yeah. And just real quick, Freemasonry is basically Gentile Kabbalah, and they're really connected to rebuilding of the Solomon's Temple, right? A good way to sum them up.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons that they call themselves Masons, is that they want to rebuild the temple. And another important aspect which relates to Kabbalah is the idea of the philosopher's stone and turning lead to gold and purifying men's souls so that they are sanctified and can participate in this divine purpose.
Interesting. I saw recently...
They're Shabbos Goyim is what they are, essentially. And they're a means of gathering intelligence, because they are told to reveal all of their secrets to their hierarchy, and therefore they're able to garner significant intelligence around the world. But they've done horrible things. Trotsky and Lenin were Freemasons. Almost the entire leadership of the Young Turks were Freemasons, and most of them were Jewish or crypto-Jewish.
I've heard the Muslim Brotherhood was Freemasons. That's what the King of Jordan said.
I believe it, and Freemasonry was very strong in Egypt, and Egypt was one of the first places where Freemasonry really took root and became extremely influential.
Yeah, and Israel too. They've got caves, and they've got monuments and stuff. So,
well, B'nai B'rith is patterned after Freemasonry.
B'nai B'rith, right? Yeah, which is behind the ADL.
The Covenant of the Cut.
The Covenant of the Cut. So, for people that don't know, though, then the Benjamin Friedman, that was about. Can you explain that about the Balfour Declaration and what getting into World War One, and then just for people that don't understand why we wouldn't have Israel without World War One and World War Two?
Theodor Herzl went around soliciting aid from the nobility and leaders of Europe. And he solicited support from the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to take Palestine, and he solicited support from Kaiser Wilhelm II to take Palestine. And the Germans were a little bit reluctant. They didn't want Hebrew to be the official language, but they did try to help. They didn't try to help enough. So in the middle of the war, there was a man who was Armenian named James Aratun Malcolm. And he proposed the idea that if the British were to solicit help from President Wilson to get the Americans to enter the war, that then in exchange for that, which the Zionists could ensure would happen because they had Wilson under blackmail, because he had written love letters to Mrs. Peck, and they held those love letters. They paid her off because she was trying to extort Wilson to get some money out of him so that she would then surrender the letters. She gave a figure. The Jewish leaders paid that sum, and then they had Wilson in their pocket. And Wilson established the Federal Reserve, the income tax, and he made Louis Brandeis Supreme Court justice, even though Louis Brandeis was extremely unpopular. And Louis Brandeis arranged, he was also a racial Zionist, and he arranged that if the British were to issue the Balfour Declaration directly to Lord Rothschild, as they did, that he would insist that President Wilson bring America into World War I on the side of the Entente, on the side of the Allies, to fight against Germany and destroy Germany. So they made a pact. And by destroying Germany, they also helped destroy the Ottoman Empire so that the British were able to go down and claim Palestine and fulfill their pact with the Zionists. But that was essentially why World War I was fought, was to disassemble the Ottoman Empire and enable the Jews to take over Palestine so that they could go there and form a homeland. And the Zionists played it both ways. If Germany won, they would get it from Germany. If England won, they would get it from England. And they made a quid pro quo deal with England to ensure that America would come in and defeat Germany. But at the same time, part of their machinations, the reasons they had initially supported Germany in the war, and all of the socialists in Germany called for Germany to enter the war, was so that the Germans would destroy the Tsar of Russia and free the Jews, destroy the Pale of Settlement, and emancipate the Jews so that they could then move to Palestine. But they were able to do that because Ludendorff sent Lenin into Russia after Kerensky had won the revolution to take over the revolution and make it Bolshevik. And at the same time, President Wilson sent Trotsky from New York to Russia to help take over the Russian Revolution from Kerensky. And Kerensky was a Freemason. His father had been Lenin's school teacher, so the whole thing was planned. And Ludendorff was essentially the military dictator over Germany during World War I. And it was a strange thing that America should be helping Trotsky go to Russia to take over the revolution and make it Bolshevik, because by doing so, they were going to arrange for a separate peace between Germany and Russia. And America was entering the war to defeat Germany, but at the same time was helping Germany by taking Russia out of the war so that Germany could shift its troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and kill Americans. So Wilson was not only betraying Americans to death to benefit the Zionist cause and no other cause, he was subverting his own efforts and increasing American casualties by sending Trotsky to Russia so that Trotsky and Lenin could enter into the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with General Ludendorff and take Russia out of the war so that Germany could then concentrate its forces on the Western Front. And it's interesting because Ludendorff was also the man who created Adolf Hitler, the politician. And then he pitted Hitler against Lenin. So World War I immediately fed into World War II. And Ludendorff wrote books about World War II, predicted World War II, and ensured that it would be a war of total war.
And they needed World War II also because, the Jews around the world didn't want to go to Palestine. They had lived comfortable lives. They were assimilating. And so that was a main purpose of it as well?
That was the greatest purpose. There were two purposes of World War II. One was to make Eastern Europe communist and hand it over to Stalin. And the other was to terrify Jews around the world so that they would go to Palestine and stay there. And also to provide the justification that the Jews had shed their blood. Not only had Gentiles shed their blood in both world wars, but the Jews had also shed their blood and therefore were somehow justified in displacing the Palestinians who had nothing to do with either war.
So Ludendorff, he was behind the Bolsheviks, and he was behind Hitler, playing both sides off one another. I
don't think he was
Jewish?
playing both sides off one another. He was trying to create a theater of war so that the Eastern Europeans would be so weakened and stressed that they would not be able to resist the communist takeover of all of Eastern Europe. Something interesting happened in the 1920s. The communists were able to have semi-successful communist revolutions in Germany and a very successful communist revolution in Hungary. And Lenin said that he wanted to march around the world, but it was the Polish under Joseph Pilsudski who stopped the Soviet advance westward. And if they had been successful in creating a corridor on both sides of Poland in Germany, especially Bavaria, later they wanted Austria too, and then they already had Hungary. And if they had been able to roll across Poland, they could have taken the entire continent very easily. So there was a special resentment among the Bolsheviks against Poland. And it's very interesting that Hitler and Stalin collaborated to split up Poland and destroy it. And throughout the war, they went back and forth, completely leveling Poland. The Nazis destroyed Warsaw and were vicious to the Polish. And Stalin instigated the Polish Home Army to fight against the Nazis at the end of the war, tacitly giving his support. And when they entered into that engagement, the Nazis destroyed them, and Stalin stood down and stood aside, even though he had his troops right there. And the specific reason that Stalin did that was so that the Polish people would be completely destroyed and completely susceptible to a Stalinist communist takeover after the war. And Churchill and Roosevelt handed all of Eastern Europe to Stalin after the war, and Hitler established the conditions for that by inviting the communists into Eastern Europe by taking it over himself initially.
Interesting.
But your point is extremely significant in terms of the idea that after the Balfour Declaration was issued, Israel Zongville was saying that Zionism was dead in 1923 and 1924 because none of the Jews wanted to go. So they started looking for other places, I think in Minsk and other parts of the Russian Empire. They were Soviet Empire. They were trying to formulate a new Zionist state. And then in Eastern Russia, later on, they created a few oblasts that they were going to utilize for the Zionist project. And then under the Fugu plan,
Jewish, or how is he connected with this Zionist agenda?
Ludendorff was a Freemason. I think that's the connection. I don't believe he was Jewish. He was a Prussian. He came up in the military. In World War I, General Falkenhayn had killed off 1 million Gentiles in the Battle of Verdun and became very unpopular. And then Ludendorff took over as a general quartermaster, first quartermaster, and became a military dictator together with Hindenburg. And Ludendorff is the key to this whole story of how Hitler came to power, and also was very significant in how Lenin came to power. There was another man who was a crypto-Jewish Freemason who went by the name of Parvus, Parvus, and his name was Israel Gelfand. And he had been a journalist and arms dealer in the Ottoman Empire and helped the Young Turks to succeed in the Ottoman Empire. And then he proposed the idea to Ludendorff that the Germans could win the war if they were to put Lenin in power in Russia to take over the Kerensky Revolution, which was still fighting Germany. And then Lenin would make a separate peace with them and pull out of the war. And then Ludendorff could instigate a number of offensives on the Western Front against the Allies, and that's what happened.
You also write about Hitler's boss, Karl Mayr, and how he wanted Hitler to be a Joan of Arc of Germany. What do you mean by that?
After the war, there was a series of revolutions in Bavaria. Initially, Kurt Eisner, who was USPD, independent social democrat, had set up a revolution and kicked out Ludwig III and the monarchy of Bavaria, and had set up Soviet-style soldiers' councils in Bavaria. Eisner's government failed. They were going to get rid of him as minister-president. He had initially contended with a man named Auer. The Catholics created a Catholic People's Party, and there was a man named Hoffman who took over from Eisner when Eisner was assassinated. And then Ernst Toller took over, had another revolution to create a Soviet communist, fully communist republic in Bavaria. Well, Hoffman was out of town, I think, in Berlin. And then Ernst Toller failed, and the most radical Shabbatayan Leninist communist, Eugen Leviné or Eugene Levine, took over. And Hitler had served all of these communist governments in the soldier councils as a propaganda liaison and recruitment specialist. And he went in and gave propaganda to the troops in support of the communists. He was a communist. And when Eisner died, there's movie film of him marching in Eisner's parade. And the famous Hitler photographer Heinrich Hoffmann photographed Hitler at Eisner's funeral.
This is
and
it?
Hitler was...
This is the photo with the armbands?
That's later. That's a swastika armband.
Okay.
And that's Goering in front of him. Goering didn't come into the picture until 1922. This was in 1918 and early 1919. November of 1918 until, I think, April of 1919. And Hitler was working for the communist governments. And in Eisner's funeral, you mentioned the armbands. He wore a black armband to mourn Eisner and a red armband to show that he was a communist.
So Hitler was
Strasser,
I'm sorry, hold on, one point I want to make. Your book, Hitler is a Bolshevik communist. Or, I'm sorry, a communist Zionist, right? Bolshevik and Zionist.
Yes.
And you also say in one of your blogs that, I like this, that the Democrats and the Republicans are communist Zionists. They're both the communist Zionist party.
Absolutely. The Democrats became communist Zionists with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was handled by a man named Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was a very strong socialist. He wanted to socialize America, and he wanted to enter into a war with Mexico, which is another thing that Ludendorff tried to instigate in World War I, was war between America and Mexico. So there's that coincidence. Ludendorff didn't create the plan, it predated him, but he tried to fulfill it. So the Colonel Edward Mandell House introduced President Wilson to socialism, and Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis introduced Wilson to Zionism. So the Democratic Party became strongly socialist and Zionist in Wilson's administration. And then when FDR took over during the Depression, he was a strong communist, and his administration was run by several Jews, Frankfurter, Morgenthau, etc. And they completely controlled his administration, and it was strongly pro-Stalin and very Zionist-oriented.
You on your blog you write here, it is not a matter of Zionism versus Bolshevism. The reality is Zionism and Bolshevism versus us. I hear this so much. You know, the Zionists are the right wingers now, and the Bolsheviks are like the Democrats. And they were working together then with Hitler, was both of these, and then now they're still working together now, is essentially what's going on.
That whole carrot and stick thing got started with Chaim Weizmann, I think in 1920. He threatened the world that if they did not support the Zionists, that the Bolsheviks would take over the world. And Churchill had long been a Zionist, and he picked up on that threat and said that there are good Jews and there are bad Jews. And he said that the Bolsheviks were controlled by Jews, and I think he named Trotsky, and then he named the Spartacists in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Liebknecht. And he issued the same threat that the West has to sponsor Zionism in order to protect itself from Bolshevism. But both of those things fulfill Jewish messianic prophecy as embodied in the one man, Albert Einstein. Bolshevism forwards the Jewish messianic agenda to establish a world government and enslave Gentiles, and Zionism fulfills the Jewish messianic prophecy of creating the center for that world government with a Jewish nationalist state. So the internationalism applies to Gentiles, and the nationalism applies to Jews and only to Jews.
Prager, you know PragerU, the Jewish Zionist with the big media.
The radio talking head?
Yeah.
Dennis Prager?
I've got a clip of him saying that the secular Jews, the ones that aren't Zionists, that their new religion is the isms, and he calls it secular messianism, and he says cultural Marxism and feminism and all these things are still like Tikkun Olam, trying to heal the world, even though they're not religious. Says they're behind all the isms. Are you going to play that clip,
or you want me to respond to your summary of it?
Oh, I'm just saying that he confirms it. And just recently in the news, there was a headline that cultural Marxism is anti-Semitic. So you're not allowed to say that term. It's considered anti-Semitic. So I want to ask you, so Hitler was built up by Ludendorff and to create this kind of a dichotomy, essentially to have Israel and fulfill end times prophecy. So was he like controlled opposition, or more like a propped up dupe? Or used? He
was not a dupe. He was a communist. He was a communist mole working for the Soviet Union. The way that it happened was after the war and after these revolutions in Bavaria, the Reichswehr, which...
He'll be back on just a second. And then I'm going to ask him about Hitler arresting the Rothschilds and then how Hitler destroyed Germany. Go ahead. I kept it rolling.
The Reichswehr, which came about as the German army after the Weimar Republic was established, created an intelligence unit to watch people in Bavaria so that a new revolution would not be established, so that the communists would not again try to take over Bavaria. And Ludendorff, in the First World War, had created patriotic instructions for his soldiers and tried to influence the German public and the German press to be more patriotic. And he said that the reason why Germany lost the war was not because the soldiers were defeated, but because strikers like Kurt Eisner and Jewish people in the press like Harden had stabbed Germany in the back during the war and had instigated strikes which crippled the munitions industry and had put out socialist anti-war propaganda against Germany, blaming Germany for the war. And that's one of the significant reasons I said that the socialists were initially pro-war and were some of the loudest voices calling for war at the beginning of the war. And then when the quid pro quo deal for the Balfour Declaration was made, the socialists universally turned against the war and started calling for peace negotiations and an armistice so that they could subvert the German war effort and increase German casualties. But
And
anyway, the Karl Mayr was an intelligence officer working for the Reichswehr, and he set up a series of these instruction courses, which were patterned after Ludendorff's patriotic instruction courses. But these instruction courses were anti-Semitic and anti-Bolshevik, because they wanted to go around and infiltrate all the emerging political parties and turn them against the Bolsheviks so that there would not be a new revolution. And Adolf Hitler, after the communists fell, became a communist informant in the Reichswehr. He was still a soldier. He did not want to be demobilized. He needed that income. So he became a rat, ratting out his fellow communists.
And he writes this in his book, right? You get this from his book of infiltrating these groups.
He never admits that he was a communist himself, but he states that his first political activity was he doesn't say informant, but fighting against the communists in the Reichswehr, working for the intelligence office. Mm-hmm. I forget exactly how he phrased it, but he really danced around and he avoided any mention of his involvement during the period of the revolution. But then somebody else
wrote about it. So, and then you wrote that it needs to be more publicized. Somebody else admitted to it, that he was his boss, right? That's Hitler's boss. That was the book?
That was Karl Mayr. Karl Mayr in 1941 wrote an article called Hitler's Boss. I was Hitler's boss. And it was published in a journal called Current History, which was edited and owned by a Ukrainian Jew in Australia. And in that article, Mayr says how he took on Hitler, and Ludendorff ordered Mayr to make Hitler infiltrate the German Workers' Party and convert it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, take it over and become dictator over Germany so that he could start the war of revenge that Ludendorff wanted for losing World War I. And it was Ludendorff who was meeting in the beer halls and coffee shops with other German generals, and Karl Mayr makes a point of saying that these were capitalists because Mayr himself was a communist socialist. And it's very interesting that Mayr, who was a socialist, and Ludendorff, who was a socialist, picked a communist named Adolf Hitler to lead the anti-Bolsheviks. It indicates that it was controlled opposition from the very beginning. And these men had to be aware that Hitler was a communist. When Hitler was informing on the other communists, they certainly informed on him. And it had to be well known in the Reichswehr that Hitler was a communist and not an anti-communist. And Hitler was not an anti-Semite. He was taught in these instruction courses that Karl Mayr set up to teach his informants how to go out and spy on people and make them anti-Bolshevik. He was taught to become an anti-Bolshevik and an anti-Semite in those courses, or at least that provided his script.
Yeah, Hitler's the post. Well, hold on. A side note, you mentioned beer halls, and that's where they used to always debate and stuff. I saw your post about how you want to have like a social media debating platform, and that you're open to doing some debates. I love that. And about Hitler destroying Germany and like destroying the German people, like the name. You wrote a little bit about that. Could you elaborate on that for me?
At the end of the war, Hitler issued what was known as the Nero Order, the way that Nero burned Rome. Mm-hmm. And he called for the German people to destroy all German infrastructure. It was kind of a scorched earth policy so that there would be nothing left for the Allies to take over when they took over Germany. Mm-hmm. But it was very similar to the plan that Henry Morgenthau Jr. issued, the Morgenthau Plan, where he wanted Roosevelt to destroy all German industry and make Germany agricultural. But Germany could not survive as an agricultural nation because it didn't have the agricultural resources to feed 70 or 80 million people. So Hitler was essentially he was calling on the German people to commit suicide.
Didn't Goebbels say
and
something?
He said,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And Hitler said that the German people were now inferior because of the dysgenics of war. All the best Germans had fell. and that the Eastern powers had proven to be superior and therefore had the biological right to destroy Germany. And Goebbels said something very similar, and that you're now all going to have your throats cut, and that's a good thing. And Goebbels was even more strongly a communist than Hitler.
Yeah, World War One, and another takeaway from World War One and World War Two was all of the strongest and many of the most intelligent Gentiles died, and then that created a vacuum where the Bolsheviks and the Zionists could take controls of all the positions of power.
In terms of Germany, England, and France, yes. In terms of Russia, the greatest decimation and destruction of the intelligentsia and the bourgeoisie came about when the Bolsheviks mass murdered 30 million of them. Mm-hmm. And they also deliberately destroyed all the agriculture so that the people would starve to death. And Stalin and his man Lazar Kaganovich, whose sister was Stalin's wife, committed the Holodomor in the Ukraine that killed 11 million people, deliberately starved them to death. And they went in and destroyed the mujiks and deliberately destroyed all the people that could make the Ukraine a successful nation. And then when Hitler came into the Ukraine, they thought that Hitler was a liberator. Mm-hmm. And they had a nationalist party headed by Stepan Bandera. And he was a Nazi. He was very pro-Hitler. And they put him in a concentration camp, and they set about again destroying the Ukrainian people and killing off all the best Ukrainians. So both world wars were horrifically dysgenic against the Slavic people in particular. And they were trying to breed them into what Trotsky, forgive me for using his expression, called white Negroes, so that they could breed this slave race to serve as the communist hammer to destroy the continent and eventually take over all the world. And they got a huge portion of the world's population when they established communist China after the war.
Yeah, speaking of genocides, you said Holodomor, and you also wrote a book on the Armenian genocide, how those are denied and downplayed, and then the Nazi Jewish Holocaust is, in a league all its own and forced upon the world by law, and so on and so forth.
You also had 50 million plus people killed in communist China. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there were 50 million who fell at the hands of the Soviets in Eastern Europe and Russia. Right. And yes, absolutely. There was a film that was kind of an expose. I think it was something to do with the ADL or something, going into Ukraine and persuading Ukrainian politicians not to utilize the words genocide and Holocaust or one or the other in one of the speeches that the head of the Ukraine was going to give. They want that to be their trademark words.
Yes.
And they also work with the Turks to deny the Armenian genocide and to ensure that the Armenian genocide not be referred to as a genocide or as a Holocaust. As
well as the Palestinian ethnic cleansing and the Nakba. I want to ask you about, so Hitler is the poster boy for anti-Semitism, but he had a lot of relationships and connections to Jewish people, and then the transfer agreement, and how was Hitler a Zionist, essentially?
The transfer agreement was a big part of it. Mm-hmm. Hitler was a Zionist by stating early on that not just Hitler, but the Nazis in general, Mildenstein, Eichmann, Hans Frank said that the solution to the Jewish problem would be solved legally by establishing a Jewish state. And that is part and parcel Zionism. Mm-hmm. So the Nazis were Zionist in creating anti-Semitism and the idea that Jews were aliens on German soil. That's exactly what the Zionists needed, so that the Jews would be forced out of their comfortable living in Germany, where they were the wealthiest people on earth, to be expelled from Germany to Palestine. And the whole Lebensraum thing was so that the Nazis would move into Eastern Europe, terrorize and concentrate the Jews of Eastern Europe. There weren't that many Jews in Germany. So Hitler had to move east to capture and terrorize the vast majority of Jews in Europe who were in Eastern Europe at the time.
And they
So
had
that is how Hitler was a Zionist. What he was doing was he was creating the incentive for the Jews to make good the Balfour Deceleration and establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he was also going to be utilized when that was attempted and didn't work because the Jews wouldn't stay in Palestine, to fulfill the prophecy of exterminating 6 million Jews so that the Jews would then have the prophetic right to return.
Do you think Hitler knew about all the Zionist prophecies and knew about their plan for? I mean, because he was essentially,
He was
if he was
supposed
a
to be
Zionist,
the world's expert on Jews. He must have.
he was helping them make Aliyah, which would help them fulfill their prophecies. So,
Absolutely. Eichmann went down to Palestine. There was a famous article written. I think it was in the SS magazine, which would have been Der Angriff. Ein Nazi fährt nach Palästina. Nazi travels to Palestine.
And then the transfer agreement, they were basically...
the transfer agreement enabled Nazi Germany to sidestep the Jewish boycott on German goods around the world and gave the Nazis funds to finance the Nazi regime and the buildup of the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht.
And the Zionist Jews had no problem with the suffering and the sacrifice of a couple assimilated Jews in Germany and around there that didn't want to go to Palestine. But then they got the Rebbe out. They made sure to get him out.
Well, the deal between Eichmann and Kastner to trade 10,000 trucks for 100,000 Jews, and the Zionists were permitted to go into the concentration camps and select the very best Jews to make Aliyah to Palestine.
Wow.
And they did not care one whit about Jewish babies or Jewish old men, and they said so. And they said that one Jew in Palestine is worth all the Jews in the diaspora. And they celebrated Hitler. They said that there would be a monument to Hitler in Palestine, that Hitler had reawoken interest in Zionism, and that Hitler was a great man.
And Herzl wrote that they needed anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was their best friend. What about Hitler arresting the Rothschilds? Or seizing their money and arresting one of them? How did that go?
That was very deep down later on into the Nazi regime. Initially, Warburg and Rothschilds were permitted to live in Germany. Eventually, Warburg left Germany and none of his assets were touched. And Warburg had been one of the heavy financiers of the Nazis through IG Farben and other business interests that he was involved in. Another really interesting thing is that Ludwig Wittgenstein had been a student together with Hitler. They knew each other from the Realschule in Linz. And Wittgenstein's sisters wanted to remain in Austria after the Anschluss. And they gave Hitler 1.7 tons of gold. And the story makes absolutely no sense, because to keep all that wealth to themselves, they were the wealthiest people in Austria other than the Rothschilds. All they had to do was move. So they had to be tacit supporters of Nazism.
Tell me about the relationship that you've researched between the Rothschilds and the Vatican and the Jesuits. You know, there's always the people that say the Jesuits are really the ones that are pulling the strings, but so what's your take on that?
I don't believe in that. The Rothschilds were involved with the Vatican through their debts. They essentially took over control of the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church spent too much money and didn't watch their spending. And Pope Leo XIII got duped into a war basically with his own Jesuits and the Freemasons and the occultists by a man named Taxil, who published a famous book that was a hoax And he had this woman say that she had been in these meetings with Jesuits and Freemasons and occultists, and they had done all these rituals, and they wanted to destroy the Catholic Church, et cetera, et cetera. But it was all a hoax, and the hoax was revealed by an occultist named Waite. And the Catholic Church was horribly embarrassed. But again, they had to diminish the power of the Catholic Church so that the Catholic Church would make no claims on Palestine and would make no claims on Jerusalem. And the Rothschilds' involvement in that was principally financial and driving the Catholic Church into debts which it could not pay. And the Catholics are also huge landholders around the world, as is the British aristocracy.
I saw in the news that Jordan King, he's the custodian of a lot of the holy sites in Jerusalem, and that he's being pressured now to give up control to Saudi Arabia or possibly the Vatican, I've heard rumored as well. And he says that the Temple Mount is his red line. Anything to add on that? Or I was going to ask you about some predictions for Trump and Bibi's elections.
Well, the Jordanian aristocracy has long been in bed with the CIA, who has provided them with all kinds of covert funding. Mm-hmm. But the Arab Spring, I think, made Arab leaders more compliant with the wishes of Israel, and that they are going to do whatever they're told to do under threat, that they will be deposed if they do not. And I think that the idea that he's going to draw a red line in the sand at the Temple Mount is a farce, because they're simply going to collapse the Temple Mount, and the King of Jordan isn't going to have a one-whit say about anything that happens with the Temple Mount.
Yeah, and that's why they want to...
It's just a means of keeping him in power as long as he's compliant. And the moment he's no longer compliant, he'll be deposed. Right. They also want to keep Jordan so that they can push the Palestinians into Jordan from the West Bank. Jordan has always served as a depository, as Lebanon has, for expelled Palestinians.
True. So what do you think? They want to. I think they want to try to take control of him and give it to Saudi Arabia, so that if it's destroyed, they will say, they have the control of it to rebuild the temple. And if at CPAC this year they had hats that were the red Trump hats that said "Not Make America Great Again" at the conservative conference, it was "Build Israel Great Again." Wonder what they want to build, right? They said it was for settlements, which is insulting in itself, but nothing they want to build more than that temple.
Yes, and they also want to take over from the Nile to the Euphrates, and the Golan Heights is a stepping stone on that path. And it's very interesting that Trump broke with the tradition of every other prior American president and said that Golan Heights is now Israeli territory. And he doesn't control the Golan Heights. What right does he have to do that? Well, and he worked together with Putin. Putin moved in and helped destroy all of Syria with his Chechen terrorists.
And Genie Energy, which is Rothschild, Rupert Murdoch, Dick Cheney, Kushner's involved with the drilling there. Do you think that Netanyahu's going to win next week in the election?
I don't know. I've been so involved in composing my books. Mm-hmm. I have volume 2 and volume 3 I'm working on, that I have not been able to devote the time to studying current events that I would have to give you an insightful answer.
Right. What about Trump? What does your gut say? Do you think Trump's going to win another election?
It sure seems like the Democrats are helping him along on that course. I think Nancy Pelosi is absolutely under the control of the same Zionists that control Trump, and she has done a great deal to help him
and Schumer,
and to avert. Oh, well, that goes without saying.
That's the leadership, Wow.
Yes.
Did you see the clip of Pelosi saying that she was at APEC and she's like, even if our capital was in crumbles, I would still be, the aid to Israel would be our main priority. Paraphrasing, just unbelievable insanity.
They've been saying that from the begining. There's nothing new about that.
Yep. So with Trump,
like that Muslim congresswoman
Ilhan
said
Omar?
that she wouldn't swear allegiance to Israel. McKinney had talked about that pledge a long time ago. Cynthia McKinney said that there was some kind of pledge that she was asked to take in support of Israel.
I believe Jim Moran as well. So with Trump in
and Paul Finley and
Paul Finley, yeah, Kushner and all of these Zionists in Trump's presidency, this is the time. Do you see them letting
well,
Trump
Kushner is especially dangerous because he's tied in with Chabad Lubavitch. And that's the real deal. And they're tied in with Likud and with Netanyahu, and they're tied in with Putin. So you now have a triumvirate between Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu that is extremely volatile and dangerous.
What do you think about Kushner, them hailing Kushner as the Moshiach? Say he succeeds Trump. Ivanka already says that they want to be a dynasty, the Trump dynasty. He's already the top advisor, and my most popular video here is Jared Kushner the Jewish Messiah? I see over 638,000 views. 666 Fifth Avenue, Chabad Lubavitch. Such power behind Trump. They credit him for getting into office. What do you think?
I would have to investigate that. I don't know what his lineage is.
Yeah, I don't know if it's Davidic either.
Yes, he would have to be of the tribe of Judah, and he would have to be of the line of David. I don't know. For some reason, Kushner's such a wet noodle that I have a hard time envisioning him as a Messiah. So I'm biased that way.
Well, they can build him up as a genius and a great
absolutely.
negotiator.
And again, I might be misreading the man. There may be something to him that we're not aware of.
Yeah. I don't believe it 100% or anything. I just see there's a lot of people are talking about it, and there's a couple things that make people wonder about it.
Well, there are good reasons to wonder about it. My gut feeling is I don't think he's the one. I don't think he has the religious training or the Kabbalistic training to be a serious contender. But maybe he does. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if he does try, because I've heard rumors that they're grooming him to be president, or Ivanka and him, could be a new power couple. He's kind of a Democrat, so he can appeal a little bit to both sides. But just say he does try to run again, and he's the first Jewish president of the United States. That would be a possibility. People would be rumoring that he's the Moshiach, wouldn't you say?
The Moshiach or the Antichrist?
Yeah, well,
one or the
aren't
other.
they the same thing?
No.
How are they not the same thing?
To the Jews, they're not the same thing. To Christians, they are the same thing.
Yeah.
So it depends on whose point of view. And to the Muslims, they are the same thing.
Well, Jews don't believe in an Antichrist, do they? They're just waiting for the Messiah still.
Well, they have the Avkat Rochelle was a Kabbalistic work, and they believe that there is a guy who will manifest himself. I think his name will be Arminius or something like that, and he'll have kind of a green aura. So they do have something similar to the Antichrist. It's not very well known. That book is translated in Johannes Buxdorf in his book, The Jewish Synagogue.
Interesting. I'll have to. You recommend that one? That's one I should check out. The Jewish Synagogue.
Oh yes. There used to be a copy of it, I think, on Google Books or somewhere online, and in its English translation. Another one that is very significant is in German. Buxdorf's book is Judenschule. Another one that's very significant is Johannes Eisenmenger. Wrote a book, the title escapes me at the moment, but I can pull it up very quickly.
Do you read a lot of books?
Yes. Used to.
Well, when did you author your first book?
Around the turn of the century.
Awesome. And you've got 14 up on your site, but you've written a lot more besides that are just not in print and not for sale. Is the best place to buy them straight from your website or just through Amazon? Oh, these link through to your Amazon, correct?
Yes, the best place to buy them is on Amazon. I'm looking into broadening that due to censorship issues and other issues. The book by Eisenmenger that people should look for is Judaism Unmasked, Entdecktes Judentum.
Awesome. People are my listeners are always looking for suggestions for good books, and I've really been enjoying yours and your videos. I'm so glad to see that your new YouTube channel. I want everybody to go subscribe. The links will be in the description below. We need to get subs up and views up. I really enjoyed talking with you. I hope we can do it again more in the future as like new more of this prophecy unfolds to get your take on things.
Well, I very much enjoyed the interview, and it's wonderful that you are so up to speed on current events as well as ancient events, and you understand that what is occurring has been a process that has been unfolding for thousands of years. And it's very, very important to understand that because it enables us to predict what their end game is and what their motivations are, and how they are utilizing the deception of political movements and wars and revolutions to continually drive forward their agenda to manifest their messianic prophecies.
Yeah. And it's coming to a head, wouldn't you say? I mean, you've been following this for over a decade, maybe even two decades coming up on now, if your first book was at the turn of the century. I mean, does it creep you out that everything is just unfolding and coming more and more true, more is being fulfilled?
My angst centers in two ways. One is what you just said, that these horrible things are about to happen. The other thing that causes me terrible angst is the fact that people aren't doing anything to stop it. And
it's like they're getting away with everything.
They're getting away with everything, and they're very, very good at infiltrating everything and preventing anyone from doing anything about it.
Yeah,
they utilize the tactics of the intelligence agencies to pit everyone against everyone else and to make everyone paranoid to the point where they're crippled and can no longer function to achieve any kinds of political resolutions to anything. Right. And yet, when they want to put somebody like Trump in power, they're very good at creating a unified force and saying that it's very important to become politically involved and everything. And they get everybody to vote for him. And then once he's in office and obviously betrays everything that he initially stood for, they say, oh, see, politics is no good, so that this guy then stays in power and there's no force against him.
Right. Yeah, it's scary. I can only imagine the wars. Yeah, I saw you were talking in that interview 2006 about Mag and Magog, and now they're really pushing. Netanyahu was just visiting all the Middle Eastern countries about Iran. That's the final country in the 7 countries of the war on terror they've had planned for so long.
Yes, the project for the new American century.
Right. And Netanyahu's books even before that about having America fight all of the wars in the Middle East against terrorism.
Well, I always suspected that Netanyahu might be Moshiach ben Joseph, the warrior Messiah, and that he's going to engage in all of the wars which will result in the construction of the temple and the takeover of all of Greater Israel.
Mm-hmm. I did videos recently.
Has been a
Go ahead. Oh, he just mixed up. I did a video recently on Netanyahu while he's coming back, and then we'll finish up here in just a couple minutes. I did here he comes. Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to rule the world.
Netanyahu has been a very significant figure in driving Israel into a us against them mentality, and trying to utilize the United States and Christian evangelicals to provoke all kinds of wars which increase Israel's hegemony in the Middle East.
Right. And with the tech too, the tech is the part that's scaring me so much, because that's really how they're going to be able to enforce the control. Benjamin Netanyahu's plan to rule the world, all a compilation of his clips talking about the tech dominance. And just the other day I did Brazil's Bolsonaro is a Zionist lackey, getting into, there's some interesting prophecy stuff surrounding Netanyahu, which, his real name is Milikowski, from Poland, and Netanyahu means gift from God or gift of God.
And the technology is also very scary. Britain is now a surveillance state. China is now a surveillance state. India is moving towards becoming a surveillance state. Mm-hmm. And once they are able to utilize technology to spy on everyone and make them compliant and slowly start increasing your electric bill if you step off the sidewalk at the wrong time or criticize the wrong person, These are horrible things. We're allowing them to enslave us and to utilize technology as a tool to do it.
Already with Kindle banning your books, and you're really lucky that you have your hard copies on Amazon still. Just recently in the news, it was a bunch were being banned.
Well, one of my books has been banned. The hard copy is no longer available. I have to find some other means of getting hard copies out and ebooks.
I saw your video.
If we
you
don't
did.
fight back, if we don't fight back, to use the cliche, it's a slippery slope. Eventually, it'll all be gone.
Yeah, they'll take
And they
away as
have
many rights as
artificial
they
intelligence.
can.
Yes, and they have artificial intelligence now to scan all of the internet and find every location where anything is deposited and deleted. They can make you a non-person.
I know. And Alex Jones setting the precedent for the public for that.
It's horrible. It's the worst of everything that H.G. Wells and The Brave New World and all of those books and George Orwell was predicting would happen.
Mm-hmm. I shared your video the other day that you did about Christopher John Bjerknes Uncensored here. You really make some great arguments that I'm going to have to write down and say myself when it comes to censorship and free thought and how they're suppressing it all. And it's just, we're living in a dystopian, apocalyptic, Brave New World nightmare right now. And we got to, enough is enough.
Well, why is it that other human beings have a greater right to representative government and to express themselves in a political manner so that they can enter the arena of politics on a level playing field, but I do not? How is it that my humanity has been deprived me, and not only my humanity, but the humanity of every single individual who wants to hear what I have to say has been stripped away? And these things did not exist when the Constitution was written. So we have to allow the Constitution to define for us how our rights have any meaning in a world in which monopolies completely dominate the public arena. How can you have a voice if your voice cannot be heard? And how can others hear you if they are not allowed to hear you?
We expose their supremacy and they flip it on us and say that we're supremacists, we're Nazis, we're anti-Semitic, but then they burn our books, like they say the Nazis did.
They dehumanize us. Mm-hmm. And they say that because we are not human, we don't have these rights. They refer to us as if we're viruses and bacteria and bacillus, and that they are simply inoculating the public from us.
Yeah, they know better.
They're evil. They're tyrannical. It's the most vicious oppression that exists anywhere, is to silence people and to not allow other people to hear the people that they want to hear. In no way can we be considered a democracy when I don't have the exact same rights to engage in the political process as every other human being.
I know the mainstream media already has such an advantage anyway, and they're already trying to tip the scales for them even more. I can see that your camera is about getting low on battery there in the corner, and I really enjoyed talking with you, Chris. I want to wrap it up before it gets too long so people will watch. I would love to have you back on as much as you want. Anytime you want to talk about another one of your books or something happening in the news. I really encourage everybody to follow your blog, subscribe to you on YouTube, check out your books on cjbbooks.com. All the links will be in the description. Subscribe, blog. And thanks for coming on. It's an honor to talk with you. Like I said in the beginning, I've wanted to chat with you more than any other researcher since I've been following this stuff. So it was great to have you respond and finally come on.
Thank you so very much. That's extremely kind of you to say, and wonderfully helpful. And I think that's the only way at this point that we're going to be able to combat this censorship is to swing back harder by spreading the message further. And you can certainly spread the message exponentially further than I have ever been able to. And I am extremely grateful to you for the opportunity to speak to you. And I'm very, very grateful to you for spreading my word.
Mm-hmm. That's what I want to do. I want to help you as much as I can and spread the message. You know, you've been covering this stuff long before I knew anything about it, and I'm hoping I'm going to be good with the title on this. I'm hoping that this will stay up and people will share it. It's the most important information that people need to be looking into. His Christopher's work has been censored, and he deserves way more people need to be hearing his information. So we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, Chris, for coming on. Christopher John Bjerknes. I'm Adam Green with No More News. Stay tuned for more videos, and I'll see you soon.